As bad as you think the war on independent media is up in Canada under Justin Trudeau's regime, it's even worse than you could possibly imagine. Here is a breakdown from the relevant period of time to the present date. Viva Frei, former Montreal litigator turned current Florida rumbler, and for a little while I've been giving the CBC a bit of a hard time. That is the Canada Broadcasting Corporation, literally a crown corporation that purports to be independent news up in Canada. It's literally a crown corporation governed by the act known as the Broadcasting Act, and it is literally subsidized by Canadian taxpayer dollars to the tune of $1.6 billion a year, at least at the last time they reported. Now, in fairness, that $1.6 billion in taxpayer dollars subsidies also goes to another crown corporation, another independent news network known as Radio-Canada. But the bottom line, CBC and Radio-Canada are state-funded propaganda outlets up in Canada that are funded by taxpayer dollars and that have the audacity of passing themselves off as independent media, despite the fact that, they actually went out and sued the Conservative government back in 2019, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go all the way back to 1991 when the most recent iteration of what is known as the Broadcasting Act came into effect. Structure. The Broadcasting Act covers three main sections: a broadcasting policy for Canada, the regulatory powers of the CRTC, that is the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Committee, if I'm not mistaken, and the operating procedures and policies for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that's the CBC. The Act imposes a Canadian-owned and controlled system of broadcasting and includes provisions regarding Canadian content in programming and production. It encourages the development of Canadian expression and the use of Canadian talent and creative resources. There is also a specific emphasis on reflecting Canada's cultural diversity. Section 3 states that programming and employment opportunities should serve the needs and interests of all Canadians and reflect their various circumstances. Won't someone please think of Canadian culture? All of these laws always have a noble cause or a noble objective. This has to protect Canadian culture, although simultaneously you got Justin Trudeau coming up and saying there is no such thing as a Canadian identity. Set all of that aside. This law was enacted in its current iteration, in the most relevant iteration, in 1991. And true, that was under a Brian Mulroney government, so that this is a law that was enacted federally, and it's not necessarily partisan. It's not necessarily partisan until one government says we want to defund the CBC, and the other one says we want to continue to fund you even more. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just stick to one thing at a time, Viva, one thing at a time. Back to 1991. Proposed amendments. The 1991 amendment would be the last major reform of the Broadcasting Act prior to the wide availability of the internet. In the 2017 federal budget plan, the Canadian government proposed a review and modernization of the Broadcasting Act as well as the Telecommunications Act in order to, quote, ensure that Canadians continue to benefit from an open and innovative internet, end quote. In this review, the government would, quote, look to examine issues such as telecommunications and content creation in the digital age, net neutrality, and cultural diversity, end quote. In mid-September later that year, the Governor in Council issued an order to the CRTC to create a report on, quote, new distribution models for broadcasting and the extent to which they will ensure a vibrant domestic market that supports Canadian content production, end quote. The report was released by the CRTC the following year on 31 May 2018 in a digital-only interactive format. Entitled, quote, Harnessing Change, end quote, the report recommended that all those who benefit from operations in Canada also contribute to the production of Canadian content. The Broadcasting Act only applied to radio and television, and at one point the government's like, hey, we've sort of lost control of the internet in that people can actually speak freely without any such requirements and or penalties under the law, and the government said, I want that. And they drafted and passed what is known as the Online Streaming Act, and that seeks to govern the internet and broadcasters on the internet the way it governs radio and television. We'll get there in a bit, but just back to the budget of the CBC. It's $1.6 billion a year. Oh crap, it's $1.4 billion. I've been wrong this entire time. Mea culpa. $1.4 billion. Canada's public broadcaster is getting an increase in funding, despite executives insisting that a request to cut CBC Radio-Canada's budget for the next fiscal year was one reason they announced layoffs of 10% of staff. So appreciate this. While some people in the Conservative government are calling for defunding the CBC, Justin Trudeau is out there giving an increase in funding to the CBC and Radio-Canada, and this after they laid off 10% of their staff because they weren't really meeting financial objectives. And we are actually supposed to believe that this entity is not going to be beholden to the government that continues to increase their funding despite their terrible performance. Independent as Pravda. From the article, Ottawa, Canada's public broadcaster is getting an increase in funding despite executives insisting that a request to cut CBC Radio-Canada's budget for the next fiscal year was one reason they announced layoffs for 10% of staff. Documents Canadian Heritage released on Thursday show CBC will get a $1.4 billion budget in 2024-2025, an increase from the $1.3 billion it spent in the previous fiscal year. I don't need to belabor the point because it's quite obvious, but this is literally how you buy loyalty from an independent media. You continue to increase their budget while the other party continues to call for its defunding. And you might recall a video from a while back that went viral of Justin Trudeau making a joke about how he knows how to buy the media through funding, subsidies, bailouts, etc., and then makes a joke that despite all this, he's still getting negative reviews from that media.
Now, you sometimes hear about liberal bias in the media these days, how they're constantly letting our government off the hook for no good reason. Frankly, I think that's insulting. It's clear that they let us off the hook for a very good reason, because we paid them $600 million. You don't get stellar headlines like these without greasing the wheels a bit. Yeah.
The headlines that Justin Trudeau claimed were negative headlines, despite the fact that he is alleged to have bought off the media, those headlines were the whitest of whitewashing you could possibly imagine. Justin Trudeau has bought off the Canadian media, and it goes well beyond increasing the budget for state-funded propaganda like the CBC and Radio-Canada. And for any of the skeptics out there who might be saying, Viva, you're being hyperbolic, you're exaggerating, the media is not biased, they're not bought off. Do you remember the time the CBC sued the Conservative Party for using some of their footage in one of their promotional political campaigns? Do you remember that? I remember that. Court dismisses CBC copyright infringement lawsuit against Conservative Party. Court finds no evidence broadcaster suffered reputational damage. A lawsuit launched by the CBC against the Conservative Party of Canada in the final days of the 2019 federal election, accusing the party of copyright infringement for using the broadcaster's footage in an online ad and tweets, has been dismissed by a federal court. In his written decision released Thursday, federal court Justice Michel Fellon found that the use of such material fell under, quote, fair dealing, end quote, and there was, quote, no objective evidence of the likelihood of any reputational damage, end quote, to the CBC. The CBC, being funded by the Liberal government, sued the Conservative Party of Canada for copyright infringement for using their material that is produced with taxpayer dollars. But set aside the argument that the material was public domain by definition, the CBC argued that the Conservatives, in using it, would damage the reputation and the brand of the CBC. I kid you not, they actually raised this argument, and by the way, they never sued the Liberals for also using their material. So not only is the CBC a totally partisan hack of an independent news network, they actually go out and do the dirty work for the government that funds them by trying to silence the voice of the opposing party. This is what the CBC does when they are asking for taxpayer dollars because they can't make ends meet because they suck so hard at doing news. They get $1.4 billion in taxpayer dollars, or maybe they got 1.3 or 1.2 billion back in 2019. They take taxpayer dollars to sue the opposing political party that represents at least 1/3 of the people whose taxes go to fund that organization. But wait, there's more in this tale of how the government goes and corrupts all of the media by buying them off, literally. From the CBC, journalists question Liberal government's $600 million media bailout plan. Quote, you have people who are dead set against the government giving any kind of money to the media, end quote. May 23, 2019. Back in 2018, 2019, the Trudeau government, in addition to the 1.3, 1.2, 1.4, however many billions of dollars they had already given to CBC and Radio-Canada, they decide that they need to buy off the print media as well, and they offer a $600 million bailout to print media because print media is incapable of succeeding on its own merits, such that it needs another $600 million from the government. What kind of loyalty do you think that would buy? The federal government's plan to support Canadian journalism is being questioned by some Canadian journalists. The Liberals have set aside nearly $600 million over the next 5 years for tax credits and other incentives aimed at propping up struggling news outlets. I'm sure that the Canadian news outlets that were struggling to survive to the point where they need a bailout from the government, well, they're sure as heck going to go bite the hand that subsidizes them. No, they will not. And yes, Justin Trudeau and his corrupt Liberal regime knows that. So as of now, we have seen the direct funding, the direct buying off of the CBC and Radio-Canada to the tune of $1.4 billion in the last year that they reported. We have $600 million bailout for print media. How do you buy off the digital media to ensure in as much as possible that they remain loyal to the government that subsidizes them? Government advertising spending, and COVID was one heck of a blessing to the digital media. From True North News, feds have spent $139 million to date on COVID ad campaigns. A breakdown of advertising and media expenditures accrued by the federal government shows that Ottawa spent $139 million of tax dollars on COVID-19 campaigns since the beginning of the pandemic. From 2019 to 2020, the federal government spent $4.494 million on COVID-19 national advertising. For the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year, that budget ballooned to $72,805,066. And do you think any of the digital media that's getting any of that $72 million for COVID ads is going to dare be critical of the government that could pull those advertising dollars at any moment? No, they will not. And if you think the government wouldn't threaten to pull its advertising dollars, you must have missed what it did to Google and Meta. In the context of the debate over the recent piece of legislation dubbed the link tax, that is the one that forces tech giants or platforms to pay a certain link just by virtue of the fact that they link through to a hyperlink on the internet. Google and Facebook said, we're not going to partake in anything that potentially has a limitless amount of money that we need to pay, so we're just not going to link to news articles up in Canada. And some of you might have noticed for a little while, there were some links that just went dead when you clicked on them because Google and Facebook said, we're not linking through anymore because we don't want to have exposure to infinite amounts of money for this link tax. Well, they said, we're going to pull our government advertising dollars from Google and Facebook. It just so happened that Google and Facebook don't give a sweet bugger all about Canadian government ad dollars, which represents a fraction of a percent of their overall income. But that is not equally true of all digital media, of all news outlets in Canada, who are much more reliant on the government. Canadian government to stop buying Meta platform ads amid dispute. The social media giant has threatened consequences over a bill meant to bolster ad revenue for news outlets. So you can see how the government actually uses advertising dollars as a shield and a sword and to buy loyalty from all news outlets in Canada. And if you also missed that example of what happened in Quebec City, because some of you might not even know what happened out there, there's sort of a rogue radio station called Radio Choix X, hosted by Dominique Moret. I've been on the channel a number of times. Well, at one point they were putting out news that was critical of the government. So what does the city of Quebec do? They pull advertising dollars from the radio station. Quebec City yanks advertising at local radio station over opposition to coronavirus measures. Quebec City has announced that it will no longer invest in advertising on the airwaves of Choix Radio X station. In a statement released Monday, the city denounced the behavior of the owners of the radio station, which, quote, constitute a danger to public health and the well-being of the citizens of Quebec, end quote. That was from September 28, 2020. Now we have seen how the government directly subsidizes, directly bailouts, and indirectly subsidizes by way of COVID ads and threatens to pull those ads to buy compliance like they did in Quebec City, like the government tried to do to Google and Facebook. Well, now we get to that piece of legislation known as, what is it called? The Link Tax Act? Hold on one second. The Online News Act, formerly Bill C-18, became law on June 22nd, 2023. The act is intended to help Canadian news organizations reach fair commercial agreements with the largest online platforms such as search engines and social media sites. And that is from the CRTC's website. The Trudeau regime passes this piece of legislation, which is effectively nothing more than finding yet another way of indirectly subsidizing Canadian legacy media. I called it at the time, and it became very clear that this was the objective, and this was in fact the outcome, as can be seen by the fact that Google and Facebook decided to pay, over $100 million a year between the two of them, that amount of money to be divvied up among accredited, legitimate news outlets in Canada. How do you think the government's going to go ahead doing that? Federal government reaches deal with Google on Online News Act. Agreement comes 3 weeks before Online News Act rules come into force. Google and the federal government have reached an agreement in their dispute over the Online News Act that would see Google continue to share Canadian news online in return for the company making annual payments to news companies in the range of $100 million. Sources told Radio-Canada and CBC News earlier this week that an agreement had been reached. Heritage Minister Pascal St confirmed the news Wednesday afternoon. And from another article, the Canadian government confirmed Google will be allowed to negotiate with a single collective instead of separately with multiple news organizations or groups of news organizations. Quote, Google will have the option to work with a single collective to distribute its contribution to all interested eligible news businesses based on the number of full-time equivalent journalists engaged by those businesses, end quote, St. Onge said. So now Google gets to pay $100 million to a single entity who decides which news outlets that money goes to based on the number of journalists they employ. If you don't understand that this is an indirect way of subsidizing the media that the government can no longer subsidize directly, I don't know how much more clear it has to be. And by the way, if you don't know who Pascal St is, here's a wonderful tweet that will show you exactly who she is. Pascal St at Pascal St _. For International Asexuality Day, let's commit to stand up for more inclusive and respectful communities. And from a government account called free2be me_ca, did you know that asexuality includes a wide spectrum of sexual and romantic orientations? Today highlights the asexual community. We urge you to learn more about this often misunderstood sexuality. Happy International Asexuality Day, April 6th. This is what our government is doing with taxpayer dollars. Oh my God. Asexuality. I gotta tell you something. I don't care about anyone's sexual orientation in the best possible way, but putting out a day called Asexuality Day, why not just have the National Day of Abstinence? It doesn't have quite the same ring to it. By the way, I don't care about what you do in the bedroom. Period. Full stop. But this is what our government is wasting money on, and that's who Pascal St is.
You are one pathetic loser.
And as if that wasn't enough, the government recently just came out with that Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, which attempts to define hatred and protect the internet. Everything the Trudeau regime is doing is intended to control the media, control the internet, directly or indirectly subsidize, funnel money off to legacy media, who is quite clearly beholden to the government, if only for financial reasons on which their very existence depends. This is the latest step, the Bill C-63, which is basically going to criminalize tweets from politically disfavored people. Norton Rose Fulbright, which is a big law firm in Canada. On February 26th, the government of Canada published the text of its latest rules for the internet. The Online Harms Act, introduced formally as Bill C-63, will result in the most significant expansion of Canada's hate speech laws and create one of North America's most rigid regulatory environments for media and social media companies. The bill follows on the heels of the Online Streaming Act, Bill C-11, which became law on April 27, 2023, and introduced Canadian content requirements for commercial streaming services and social media platforms to be implemented by the CRTC. Together, the two pieces of legislation will overhaul how companies that do business online are regulated in Canada. You know what it's going to do in Canada? It's going to criminalize politically disfavored speech, full stop. It's going to find more indirect ways of subsidizing a media, buying their loyalty in ways that they can no longer do directly, because the government is maxed out on direct subsidies, it's maxed out on bailout, it's maxed out on COVID advertising dollars because COVID is no longer a thing, so they got to find another pretext. Now it's online harm, online hate, and they've got to go regulate the internet, suppress politically disfavored speech while indirectly subsidizing the media and buying their continued loyalty. This is how you control a country, people. And I don't mean that as a compliment, I mean that as a tyrant. Justin Trudeau is really raising the bar, where you've got probably Putin and Kim Jong-un looking at Trudeau and saying, my goodness, you sure did it legally. Every piece of legislation being passed in Canada right now is going to turn Canada into a hermit kingdom, and you're never going to know about it because the only media that's going to be allowed to exist in this hermit kingdom is going to be loyal to the government that funds them. So people, this is your wake-up call. I don't know how much clearer it has to get. Pierre Poilievre, Conservative Party, start doing something, because thus far you've been all talk and no action, because this is the legislative framework in Canada. This is the free speech framework in Canada, and it's only going to get worse from here. That's the overview. If you didn't know this before, now you know it. And if you like what I do, like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, yada, yada, yada. Viva Frei on Rumble, the Viva Frei on Twitter, vivabarneslaw.locals.com for the bestest community on the internet. But most important than anything, exercise, eat healthy, get outside, sunlight, talk to people in real life. And now you know your vlog. Peace out, peeps.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China, because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about, of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted, that I find quite interesting.